Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today we're going to talk about Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, probably the most famous chess book ever written. I just received the new 6th edition. Previously I've reviewed the 5th edition and I've held all the previous ones in my hands but haven't reviewed them. The 6th edition has been updated, reviewed and revised by Karsten Müller and Alex Fishbein, two great endgame experts who have also worked on the 5th edition as well as the Fasttrack edition of the manual. So let's begin by saying that the manual is a book on theoretical endgames that covers everything, and that cannot be said about any other book. Even though there have been many comprehensive books written on theoretical endgames, the Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual is the only one, in my opinion, that covers everything well. Before we talk about the book, let's compare different types of endgame books for clarity's sake. So let's compare these 5. Okay, so first of all, we have Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. Theoretical endgames that include exercises, so it's also partially a workbook, and it also covers partially at least complex endgames and goes well beyond the simplest theoretical endgames that are finite and can be solved by table basis. Secondly, 100 Endgames You Must Know workbook by De La Villa and Endgame Play by Jakob Agard. Two very different endgame workbooks. Endgame Play is complex, so it covers more complex endgames with more pieces on the board, and it focuses more on strategic ideas in the endgame, but it's a workbook, it's not a book you can just read. And then 100 Endgames You Must Know is a workbook on simple theoretical endgames. So these are books you work from. You don't read them in order to learn endgames. And then finally, a simple book on theoretical endgames, Jesus de la Villa's 100 Endgames You Must Know. These are just theoretical endgames, but not all of them, and not in great detail. This is suited for low-rated players when compared to the manual. So very different type of a theoretical endgame book. And then in the end, Technique in Chess, also by Dvoretsky, but basically written by Artur Yusupov, who has compiled Dvoretsky's material. These are complex endgames, and there are more. I have more endgames here. Endgame Corner by Müller and Fishbein, who have actually revised the 6th edition of the manual. But this is purely strategy. It's basically about converting winning endgames. So there are different types of endgame books. Usually they are divided into theoretical endgames, complex endgames, and workbooks. Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual is all of that. Okay, it covers the simple endgames, it covers more complex endgames, but not in great depth. And it also includes exercises, but not as many as a workbook. Okay, so 6th edition so far. Before I get into the book, I want to talk briefly about what's new. They have expanded it a bit, although there weren't any significant changes. In the structure, there weren't any changes, I think. They have revised some positions, changed some of them, improved some of them, even changed the evaluation in some of them, and corrected many mistakes. As this is a very popular book, people and readers who've been going over it have found numerous mistakes, so those have been corrected. Now, the structure. Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual covers everything. Okay, so first of all, it begins with pawn endgames, and you can find very, very simple concepts such as key squares, the opposition, triangulation, and basically all the basics you have to cover. Everything you find in De La Villa, for example, has been covered in the manual. And then the book moves on to more complex pawn endgames and covers slightly more complex ideas like Zugzwang, the pendulum, shouldering, breakthrough, outside passed pawn, two connected passed pawns. Basically, you get to learn all the thematic patterns. After that, Dvoretsky devotes chapters to, I would say, elementary endgames such as knight versus pawn and bishop versus pawn, but you still have to know them. And then we get into the real stuff. Opposite colored bishops, bishops of the same color, bishop versus knight, rook versus pawn, and then chapter 9 begins covering rook endgames. And I have to say, the rook endgames in the manual are by far the best resource for learning rook endgames I've ever held in my hands. And all in all, chapter 9 is divided into 30 subchapters. And the titles tell you a lot about the detail level. So, for example, the rook in front of the pawn with the pawn on the 7th rank. The rook in front of the pawn with the pawn on the 6th rank. So, every important rook endgame is covered in great detail. And after you're done with rook endgames, then you have a few more simple chapters, such as rook versus knight, rook versus bishop, queen endgames, queen versus rook, which are, I want to say, not as important, because pawn endgames and rook endgames are the essence. Everything else is great if you know it, but you will lose most points if you don't know rook and pawn endgames. And then finally, chapter 15 deals with general endgame ideas, and this might be my favorite part of the book. I'm a fan of actually written word when it comes to chess books, not, going over lines. And it includes king activity, pawn power, Zugzwang fortresses, a fortified camp, a pawn barrier, an imprisoned king, an imprisoned piece, binding, stalemate, checkmate, domination. Okay. And finally, in chapter 16, there are solutions to the problems. So, how should you use the book? I'm going to tell you how I use it, and then I'm going to tell you how I tried to use it when I first began playing chess, and then I'm going to talk about the difference between the two approaches. So when I first started playing, I had borrowed the second edition of the book from a friend of mine. And I've been hearing, great things about the book. You need to learn the end games. You need to read the manual. I took the book and I almost threw up. I mean, it was so incredibly boring and so incredibly difficult that I had gone through maybe 2 pages before setting it aside, and I hadn't picked it up again for I don't know how long, but long enough. And then about a year later, I decided that I actually do need to go through it carefully, and I took it up again. And I went through maybe 20 pages, something like that, gave it up again. I finally did manage to force myself to go through the entire book, and it was sort of a New Year's resolution thing, and I even began covering all the endgames on YouTube, but then I sort of rushed through it, and I didn't get much from it, and the proof is that I kept messing up the endgames I have read about. So, if you want my advice, take up the second approach, which has worked for me. So since then, and what I told you about was 7 years ago, I've been using the manual as an index, as a reference point, and it's been incredibly useful. To do that, I also use Jesus de la Villa, and I'm going to explain how I do that and what I do. So you play a tournament game, or if you don't play tournaments, you play an online game. You were in an endgame which you either didn't fully understand, or you didn't convert it, you lost a drawn endgame, or you drew a winning endgame, or even worse, you lost a winning endgame. What type of endgame was it? Get de la Villa, get the manual, open the chapters on that endgame. For example, let's pretend, for argument's sake, that you had an endgame with bishops of the same color. I recently had a game against international master Nenad Doric in the Pula Open. You can find that game. I hadn't marked this. This is just awful, I should have, in the Pula Open this year. And I remember vividly thinking, okay, I can easily draw this endgame. And when I set it up over the board, it turned out that it was very easily drawn. I have, however, messed it up. Okay, so what you can do, if I ever manage to find this chapter, it's 132, not 122. So what you can do is learn from Dvoretsky's Endgame manual after the game, which isn't as great as actually drawing the game, but still. So what I did when I came home from the Pula Open, I opened the chapter in bishops of the same color, and I went through the entire thing. So it begins by going over minimal material. So bishop and pawn versus bishop. These endgames were first subjected to thorough analysis in the mid-19th century by the Italian player Santorini. Later, significant additions to the theory were made by Auerbach. And then Dvoretsky covers the simplest things. What if one side has a pawn, the other side has none? What if it's 2 versus 1? The book is full of what Dvoretsky called tragicomedies, which feature, failed attempts to either draw or win, and it's also full of exercises. Now, after that, we get to Zugzwang. With a bad bishop, the weaker side's defensive hopes often are destroyed through Zugzwang. Now, look at the game I played against Nenad Doric. And then look at this. I'm actually going to set it up over the board for you. I need more white pawns. Okay, and I'm gonna need a bishop for each side. Okay, so this is the position, and as I said, Dvoretsky writes, with a bad bishop, the weaker side defensive hopes often are destroyed through Zugzwang. This is a study by Yuri Auerbach. It's white to play. The correspondence between the f3 and the f7 squares is obvious. To win, it's necessary only to give black the move. If you like, you can also find other pairs of corresponding squares. For example, the f1 and the b3 squares also correspond to f7, but there is no real need. So, bishop e2. Okay, and after bishop e2, black is in Zugzwang. Black played bishop e8. And Dvoretsky writes, if bishop g6, then bishop d3. And after bishop h7, bishop f1. And it's impossible to defend everything. So bishop g8, bishop e2, bishop f7, bishop f3. But in the game, after bishop e2, bishop e8 was played, and now the simple bishop d3, bishop g6 trying to defend both pawns, bishop c2, bishop h7 has to keep defending f5, and now bishop b3 exclam. And now if you play bishop g8, which happened in the game, bishop d1, bishop f7 has to keep defending h5, and finally bishop f3 is the end of the game. And there is nothing left for black. Black either has to move the king, allowing the white king into e5 or c5, or black has to move the bishop, losing either d5 or h5. And this is a great example, which is actually very similar to my game against Nenad Doric. So the game against Nenad Doric, when he pushed that pawn on the queen's side, I couldn't decide whether I should trade or not. I had plenty of time on the clock, maybe 20 minutes. And yeah, just look at what happened in the game. I was trying to prove that I'm confident. I was playing quickly, and other than not trading that pawn, everything I did was correct. But as you can see, as soon as the pawn advanced to a5, I was completely losing due to the same pattern. So why is it important to study the endgames you didn't understand from the manual. So take the example we've been looking at. It's extremely similar to my game. So what I did after the game is I read that chapter and I thought, yeah, okay, I understand that. That's how I lost. How do I not do that? Keep going. Now let's look at a considerably more complex endgame. And then Dvoretsky goes on and says a lot about a lot of thematic positions. And there are also a lot of rules, pawns which do not play by the rules. In chess, there are no absolute laws. Even so important and generally useful an axiom as the unprofitability of placing one's pawns of the same color squares as one's bishop must occasionally be broken. Here are the possible reasons for doing so. To restrict the mobility of the enemy bishop using one's own pawns, as occurred in the preceding example. The need to undermine the enemy pawn chain and the attempt to create an impregnable fortress around the bad bishop. So there are many examples of bishops of the same color in which either one side messed up or they played correctly. There are exercises, there are patterns like the barrier. I'm going to read this one as well. Although there are occasional cases where a player can save himself with his pawns on the same color as his bishop, such a defensive method is not to be recommended in the majority of cases. The more secure defensive method is to control the squares of one color with the bishop and of the other color with pawns. This places a barrier in the path of the enemy king, making it difficult to invade our camp. So if you actually go through that chapter after losing the game to Nenad Doric, which is what I did, I'm confident that you would at least put up more resistance the next time you have that endgame. Okay? And that's how I used Dvoretsky's endgame manual. I find that extremely rewarding because there is something very tough about dealing with your mistakes, admitting that you simply aren't knowledgeable or skilled enough to navigate those endgames, and accepting the fact that you have to pick up a book and learn. If you lose bishops of the same color 10 times, go through the chapter 10 times, analyze all the positions 10 times, eventually there will come a time where you won't lose anymore. That being said, every time you mess up an endgame, you need to do the same thing. Now, Rook Endgames feature many more positions. Bishops of the same color is one of the simpler examples because there are very few rules. In my opinion, everyone should read Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual the way I just described. Don't read it like The Lord of the Rings. It's not a book you need to read from cover to cover, and it's very likely, depending on your resistance to difficult tasks and boredom, that you won't manage at all. I think of myself as a very diligent chess learner, and I failed 3 times. Read it when you need it. Use it as an index. Use a simpler book on the side. Okay. Now, the difficulty. I think many grandmasters would struggle to solve everything that's in the book. Depending on their knowledge and skill level, there will be positions that are incredibly difficult, even for the top guys. That being said, that shouldn't discourage you from actually learning from the book. The book is way too difficult for me. If you generalize and take the hardest problems and say, okay, you need to solve every one, it's way too hard. It's way too hard for people higher rated than me. Of course, then a 1500 rated player would struggle with almost every problem. But even if you don't manage to solve the problem, even if you try, fail, look at the solution, you are learning. And that's why I think that you need to get this book regardless of your rating. Just use it as a reference point. Don't be discouraged. Don't set yourself a goal as high as I need to solve everything, learn everything. That simply won't work. Now, even though technically it's enough on its own, what I like to do is I like to have workbooks. So once you lose the game against Nenad Doric, which is what I did, go through the chapter in Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, and then get endgame workbooks. There are many. These are my favorite ones. open up the chapter on the type of endgame you'd lost and solve every problem. Now imagine, every time you messed up an endgame, if you went through the chapter in Dvoretsky on that endgame, and if you then solved all the problems on that endgames, on that type of endgame for one or two workbooks, eventually you'd become really good, which is the goal. So in conclusion, if you haven't read it yet, if you haven't got it on your chess bookshelf, you should. One final thing in the end, I don't think it's very important to get the final edition, although I'm a completionist. I want to have all of them. The 5th edition is good enough. So is the first one. The fact that there are mistakes and misevaluated positions, you aren't Magnus Carlsen, who cares? You're going to benefit from it all the same. So if you can find the cheaper copy of the 4th edition or the 3rd, just get that. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, I hope you got something from the video. Let me know what you think. If there is a book you would like to review for Chessreads, we began introducing guest reviews, and they have been very well accepted. The idea behind Chessreads is to eventually become a community platform where you will be able to read 100 reviews of, let's say, Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual by 100 different players of varying strength. So that way you can listen to what I have to say about it, what a 1200 player has to say about it, and what a Grandmaster has to say about it. So if there's a chess book you'd like to go over, please contact us, and yeah, we'll add you as a guest reviewer. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.